Hi everyone, we're live. Welcome to another Scholastic Lutherans video. We are reacting today to the On the Line debate on Christian nationalism. And if you want to watch the video yourself, there is a link in the description. Sorry about that. I suddenly had my own stream coming through because I had it on YouTube. So I was hearing myself 3 seconds off. And you can watch the video itself, though, in the description. We're obviously going to be putting it on screen as we're going through it and reviewing it. But we aren't going to go through the entire video, which can also be found on your standard podcast apps, such as Spotify or Apple Podcasts and things like that, because it's simply too long to react to the whole thing. It is approximately 2 hours, and that is just too much to do a reaction to without us taking 5 hours to react to the whole thing. But if you want to watch the whole thing, please go watch that. I'll be putting it up on screen here shortly. We did want to give a brief introduction to some of the discussion because we're going to be skipping into the middle of it when we begin, simply because, like I mentioned, we're not doing the whole video as a review. And preface it probably with that Ramirez comes into this discussion, for those of you who are familiar with more familiarity with the literature, people like Torba and Wolf. He is familiar with the online conversations that have been going on. And Bierman comes into this not being that familiar with that online discourse. He's more familiar with, I guess, the folk level, as they call it. And we will let them get into the definitions of that. But I think that's an important thing to know going into the stream, because it's going to be kind of a relevant thing that's going to be, pertinent to the rest of the video. So I recommend, if you want more on that and the discussion leading up to it, watch the section before that we're starting at, but that's a relevant thing to know. I also like to plug the political content that we are working on. So we're compiling, or rather I'm compiling, a bunch of our Lutheran dogmaticians on the doctrine of the magistrate. So this is political theology gathered from treatises and dogmatic texts. So there are over 20 authors in the compend. I hope to have it out in 2026, or maybe if I'm fast about it, late 2025. No promises, but it's going to be a quite lengthy collection because I am including in full the sections on the civil magistrate from so many authors, including people from our confessions and our greatest theologians from the 16th, 17th, and early 18th century. So full spectrum of our great dogmaticians on the topic. So look forward to that in the future. We'll be selling that on Lulu and Amazon, and we hope you'll enjoy that one. And we can go ahead and get started here in a second. It did just occur to me that if I put this through my speakers, I think I'm going to have it play back double, but we can test that out too, maybe. I might have to put on headphones. I wasn't thinking about that earlier. Let me put in headphones real quick before we get going. Noah and Sam, if you guys want to talk about anything while I do this.
Yeah, I have a few opening thoughts. So the debate is a little bit of a mess. It's more of a discussion because the two speakers are not defining Christian nationalism in the same way. Seth kind of laid out the basic contours of that. Bierman is defending much more of, as he describes it, the sort of the boomers who wear their cross and flag shirt on the 4th of July versus sort of Torba, Isker, Wolf, the sort of more maybe intellectually rigorous versions of Christian nationalism. So there's a sort of bias perhaps to our viewers to say, well, Bierman is just wrong with this. I would encourage you to ask yourselves what is exactly wrong with the God and country flag, besides maybe sort of the cringe aesthetic, right? You don't want your pastor wearing a flag tie, probably, right? But what's the issue here? Is the issue just that there's a cringe aesthetic, or is the issue no, because those people tended to support, let's say, genocidal bombing of innocent civilians in the Middle East because they voted for George Bush? You have to get down to brass tacks with these sorts of things, and I find a very pathological, endemic, like ignorance of sort of the real politic or the on the ground political realities here. Lutherans often tend to be much more, I just don't, this God and country thing, I don't know. but it feels like we might be tilting at a windmill here or something that we don't fully understand. So I think being aware of the actual political realities is something that's going to be a recurring theme of what's missing in this debate. Because as soon as they get down to brass tacks, things move on and we're attacking another straw man of some kind. So just keep that in mind as we click through this.
And I'm back, and I am going to play this at low resolution because I don't have my Ethernet cable hooked up, and you can't tell I'm at a new house. I haven't wired my Ethernet yet. So I'm going to play this at low resolution. There's nothing on screen other than their faces. So it's like I said, this is like podcast material. So you can just, deal with my 144p. And they're going to jump right into the discussion on the different types of Christian nationalism here and what we've been prefacing this with. Nope, it double clicked.
Have that naivete, or at least I would say, which Christian nationalists are you talking about?
Okay.
Because I can speak for myself. I certainly look at the scriptures and I see a great sensitivity to the particular situations and circumstances on how that gets played out in political jurisdictions. Like, it's very obvious that God wants, kiss the sun lest he be angry and he perish in the way. I mean, all kings, all rulers, all nations are to worship God. And yet at the same time, you see a vast difference between how the Israelite kings deal with this versus Nebuchadnezzar or the Assyrians and things like that. So I agree with you, but I would push back that at least myself is naive about that. I think that where you are at has to be taken into account. You have to be prudent. You have to be realistic about not just the fallenness of the world, but that particular place and those circumstances. Similar, I'd like to hear more about their misguided goals, but my overarching question to you right off the bat would be like, who do you see as Christian nationalists in your description doing what you are guilty of doing what you have asserted?
You want name? I'm not going to name names. But I'm probably capable of even doing that. Saying, well, this person. My concern is the part of this is problematic. We should just address this also. Part of this becomes problematic because we have the media, which most of us in the church are suspicious of. The Western media as a whole, who like to pillory the church whenever they can.
We got buffering.
And try to badmouth the church. And so to bring up Christian nationalism.
And more buffering somehow too. Apologies on the buffering. That should go away. I don't know why we're getting buffering at 144p.
It creates this huge boogeyman that people are terrified of. Oh, look, these Christian nationalists. Yeah. But unfortunately, there are people from the evangelical world who jump right into that and kind of own that. And you start seeing the conflation of Christian witness and American patriotism. So I'm a good Christian. That makes me a good American. And the American flag is wrapped around the cross. And that's the kind of stuff that sort of drives me nuts. It's the 4th of July stuff when people start doing we're going to have our patriotic service this weekend. And so you see the Christian flags coming out everywhere in the church. And then you'll see Grandma Schmidt, who comes to church, but she's got her Christian t-shirt on, and it's kind of Grandma Schmidt's I know anyway. And it'll be a cross emblazoned with the American flag right across the cross, this kind of thing. That's the kind of stuff that I think is really misguided, because I think people start to conflate church and their nation. That plays into this. And then you have people who start thinking that if we could just get this person elected, if we could just get this law passed, that's going to fix things. No, it's not. And that becomes part of this kind of the agenda. If we could just do this. And the concern I have is people start to focus more on those things instead of what I contend to be the things they should be focusing on, which provides a better witness to the world.
Yeah. So I have some very, very similar concerns about all the same things. I don't think we're in disagreement about that kind of confusion or improper mingling between, cross and country. Yet at the same time, I guess a follow-up question would be, is there not, though, also a good inherent desire for people to want to have their social political community to be united in not just common civic life, but also common faith. And that's a natural good desire.
Yes.
And so I guess I would make a distinction between kind of folk Christian nationalism and a lot of what you're talking about versus the conversation going on in the last, 3 to 4 years about Christian nationalism that doesn't just include kind of the heirs of Jerry Falwell or the 700 Club or whatever.
Yeah.
I think we'd be agreed on our evaluation of those folks. But that's why I want to probe a little bit more deeply, because you already said what I was going to say. A lot of this reaction against Christian nationalism is the boogeyman of, NPR or whatever.
Yep.
You know what I mean?
Yep.
Like,
oh, absolutely.
Yeah. And they're not fair.
No.
At all.
No. But they can find people who do what they're accusing them of. There are people who do this, out there in the wider world.
I agree.
Evangelicalism. Yeah.
Sure.
So they exist.
But they do exist. Mm-hmm. And that's been a problem for decades. It's nothing new.
Correct.
But I'm talking more about like what, and I know you said, well, I'm not going to name names, but I really think that like Christian nationalism now in the last 4 or 5 years, there's a real variety of Christian nationalism.
I agree with that.
There was a great paper put out by Cambridge University do you know their publication, Politics and Religion?
No, I haven't.
Yeah, it came out just this summer or late spring, and it was called The Varieties of Christian Nationalisms.
Okay.
And they had a very good diagnostic tool
okay.
Yeah, and it was a threefold distinction. It was kind of what we're talking about. They called it charismatic Christian nationalism because a lot of the folks are heirs of Jerry Falwell, and it's kind of this cross and country thing in kind of a folk way that is very problematic. But then they also pointed to like Catholic integralists, which that's its own sideshow, so to speak.
It is.
Yeah.
But it's not irrelevant.
No, it's not irrelevant, not at all. But then they also pointed to magisterial Reformed Christian nationalism, or they called Calvinist Christian nationalism. Yeah. And that's really burst on the scene. And so, I mean, I think we got to be careful about like, who are we talking about?
That's fair.
So who are you talking about?
I'm concerned about the kind of Roman Catholic integralism, which to be clear is this idea that God is ultimately in control of everything. And so the world works best when the church is running everything. That's kind of bottom line, boiling it all down.
Yeah.
And it's what we saw in the Catholic Middle Ages. They haven't given it up. It's still there.
Of course not.
And so there are people who are trying to reassert this. You get the Patrick Denis.
No, you had a comment?
Yeah, and you guys can jump into as you wish. I mean, the problem with integralism is that it gets things backwards from what a proper Christian nationalist philosophy would entail. Whereas good Christian nationalism has the state under a godly prince enforcing the 2 tables of the 10 commandments, or however theonomic you want to get. Whereas integralism wants the church to have control over the state. So that's the issue with integralism, not per se some sort of vague, oh no, the church and state are getting too cozy. It's just a reversal of the proper authority channel.
Right. And what happens with the Roman Catholics with this at the time of the post-Reformation period is that they actually end up excluding the layman from having power in secular matters. This is what this does, because if you make the clergy the ones who are in charge of the magistrate, then no longer are laymen in the magistrate. So you end up with this issue where laymen are excluded from doing things in the secular realm. And they're going to talk about Patrick Denis here too, as a post-liberal Roman Catholic political philosopher, contemporary to the current period, meaning he's still alive. Apologies for buffering.
Who are huge fans, and it's got legs into some of our leaders in Congress right now, and some of our political leaders who are very sympathetic to this. And that's like, that's kind of crazy.
Yeah.
But what's even crazier is when you have evangelicals who are getting on board with it because we're going to make a Christian America. That is a concern, and I'm hearing you say you're not crazy about that either.
Yeah, and I guess I would push back against. Well, let me just ask a diagnostic question. When you say evangelicals getting into the Catholic integralism, I'm sure they're out there.
Yeah,
but that is not the main trend. The most prominent, if you want to say Reformed, magisterial Reformed, or Calvinist Christian nationalists have explicitly rejected Catholic integralism as a idea that, I mean, everyone's going to agree that God is in control over everything and is Lord over everything, but they would explicitly and have explicitly in their books rejected that the church is over the state.
Yeah.
Because, I mean, the two most prominent Christian nationalist books, because the folk Christian nationalism is more of a cultural thing, and there's not a lot of books written. It's much more
grassroots, just
grassroots. Yeah. I mean, there's a few books like that Seven Mountain stuff. That's all wrapped up with charismatic stuff, like Paula White, Trump's advisor, spiritual advisor,
right.
that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
But the Calvinist Christian nationalists explicitly reject that and the Catholic integralism, and they really focus in on not something that we would 100% agree with, but as magisterial Lutherans, at least in terms of history, in terms of understanding it, it's much, much closer to us. And the two most significant books are definitely Andrew Torba and Andrew Isker's book. That's just called Christian Nationalism. It's super popular, and it ranked number 12 on the Amazon nonfiction books the week after it was released. I mean, that's all nonfiction books.
Yeah, right.
Number 12. So I think that in terms of fair representation of what the Christian nationalists who are driving the discussion are saying, there's not only different ones, but that one. And then the other one that is very dense and very theological and trying to do a Reformed, specifically Anglo-American Reformed presentation is Stephen Wolfe's book, which is The Case for Christian Nationalism. And I don't think that without having those books central to at least Reformed Calvinist Christian nationalism, we without identifying these different varieties, because that's what's driving the conversation. I mean, book sales, reviews, and all the discussions on podcasts and things like that, it's being driven far more by that, which NPR and the quote unquote, leftist media is only focused on the charismatic one. And that's what's actually driving the debate.
But that might be driving the debate on an academic level or in those
even
circles.
Popular level.
But I'm not so sure about that. The popular level I encounter, I don't see many people aware of that. They're more kind of like I was saying, the kind of classic 4th of July sort of, just me and my American faith, and and I think the full popular level is still really quite dominant.
I agree, and that's how that's how it works off. It works out on a parish level.
That's where I'm coming in. Yeah,
but
you know about that.
I totally agree. Yeah, but I think that there's also a generational divide because on the parish level, those books are being read. Even if they're not being read, the podcasts and the blogging and all of that kind of stuff is paying attention. And I think those two texts, I don't agree with all of it.
Yeah,
I mean, the Torba Isker book puts out a very mild form of Christian nationalism, far more mild than anything in Lutheran Saxony. And the Wolfe book is very rooted in the Anglo-American experience. And again, it's not Catholic integralist, and it's not just kind of, God and country folk Christian nationalism. And so, I mean, I think we got to be aware that that's where most of the discussion is being driven among younger, engaged Christians.
Yeah, and that's fair. That
is kind of the end of the section. If we want to go to the next session after discussing, I do want to point out I did put the link into the paper to the paper that Ramirez was referring to, excuse me, in the chat, but the link was too long. It looks like I didn't want to keep it as one comment. But there is a Cambridge paper on this in the Journal of Politics and Religion, which is an open access journal, so you can go and read it without having academic university access. It is written from a pretty left-wing perspective, to be clear, but it's a decent paper nonetheless. He did mention for the literature on the folk stuff. Yeah, there is. If anybody's curious, there is Invading Babylon: The Seven Mountain Mandate, which is by Bill Johnson and Lance Wallnow. We're obviously not a big fan of the Word of Faith, New Apostolic Reformation on this channel. Jared has critiqued them many times. But yeah, I think that was a good introduction in terms of what they're covering in the debate for types of Christian nationalism, and more so what Ramirez has in mind when he's discussing this and what Bierman has in mind, because they aren't necessarily on the same page with that, other than both not being Catholic integralists. Do you have any comments before we go to the next spot, maybe?
Are they going to talk about the two kingdoms?
I don't think they ever did a deep dive on the two kingdoms. Okay. Unless I'm mistaken. I've listened to it like 3.5 times, and
no, I don't think they really do. I don't think
it gets discussed throughout.
I prefer to talk about two sets of tools rather than kingdoms or realms, and I think that's actually the Lutheran view. But we can table that for another time.
Yeah, they don't really get into a ton. One interesting thing I will say for having done all this translation of the political compound, and by that I mean machine translation, but I read it afterwards, obviously. The idea of two realms being this central thing to Lutheran theology is just not a category you see in the dogmaticians at all. At least the 16th and 17th century dogmaticians, you just don't see this as the categories they're using. They talk a lot about the three estates. They do talk a lot about the magistrate. They talk a lot about the church and the ecclesiastical hierarchy in the church and the hierarchy in the magistrate. They talk a lot about laymen and citizens. They talk about all that type of stuff. But the idea of two kingdoms is just not the categories they typically are speaking in, actually. That phrase doesn't really come up in our dogmaticians at all as the major category for discussing Lutheran political theology, which is probably surprising to people, given that you hear a lot about two kingdom theology in, I guess, modern Lutheran discourse. And it probably would be a good idea to, I guess, give a basic idea on what is a magistrate too from the Lutheran dogmaticians, because what are they thinking of, just to give a kind of background to the debate, because I think it is relevant to the subject that people know at least a basic definition of what is the magistrate and what it's supposed to do. My personal favorite on this is Hallatz. I really like Hallatz on the topic. I think he's the best person who handles this. I have not read the larger dogmatics texts of Gerhard, Kalov, or Quenstedt. I've read the single volume from Gerhard and Kalov. They have single volume dogmatics texts, and I've read those on the topic. But Hallatz does a really good job. He defines this in 2 different questions. And the first one, he's addressing the magistrate in the abstract, and the second one, he's addressing it in the concrete. And so Hallatz says the magistrate, understood abstractly, is a public office ordained by God in which a certain person, lawfully called and endowed with authority concerning civil and sacred matters, enacts laws, exercises judgments, and punishes transgressors in the republic. And republic is being used here very generally just for any state, any nation state, and defends it against external enemies for the propagation of the glory of God and the promotion of temporal and eternal welfare of the subjects. And then the concrete, he says, it's a person or a multitude of persons divinely called and endowed with authority concerning civil and sacred matters, for enacting laws and exercising judgments, for punishing transgressors, and defending the republic from external enemies, so that God may be glorified, the church may flourish peacefully together with the republic, and the temporal and eternal welfare of the subjects may be promoted. So there is definitely not a separation of church and state in the American sense like we think of, and the goals of the magistrate include things related to ecclesiastical ordinance, as well as eternal welfare of the citizens. And both Bierman and Ramirez in the early part of the video acknowledge that they are, not here to jump on and support American democracy or American exceptionalism or liberal democracy, or anything of that notion. So they are on the same page on some of these things for sure. But I think it is important to keep in mind what the goal of magistrates is, or what the goals of the magistrate are, according to our dogmatic tradition. Are we good to, do we want to move on to the next section we wanted to cover?
Let's do it.
Sure. So in the meantime, they discussed a lot about prudence. If you're curious on if the chat is curious on what they go through between the sections we're discussing, they're both quite concerned with prudence on, how they should, exactly implement anything at a given time. But we're going to skip to about 58 minutes. I'll give it a few seconds before so we can get some of the lead up in. But this next section, they are going to have a discussion that leads up to issues about immigration, other religions, the public practice of other religions, enforcement of the first table of the law, and specifically the external observance of that, how the magistrate relates to the external observance of the law, because they both are on the same page that the magistrate should enforce external observance of the law, but they have different ideas about what that looks like in actual implementation.
And you'll notice
church, I would contend, acts like one more special interest group trying to fight for something, we end up diminishing the church.
Yeah. I mean, I think I'm totally agreed that we need to be prudent about it.
Okay.
I'll throw something out, and maybe this will help get some grist for the grind.
Right.
I think that all of the major, let's just say, magisterial Reformed Christian nationalists of any prominence would totally agree about your point about prudence.
Okay.
I don't know much about the charismatic ones because that's more folk. The Catholic integralists, they actually talk a lot about prudence too. And so I guess even while we would agree on it needs to be incremental and it needs to be prudent and sensitive to the circumstances, and politics is the art of the possible, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
At the same time, I think that I can sense I'm much more okay about having a prudent yet also aggressive, active desire to get stuff done.
Yeah. Okay. And that aggressive, active desire, I think, is probably where the problem starts to come in.
Okay.
What's that look like? What are you trying to do? And what is the church's reputation? What is the church portraying to the community around us, to our own people? What are we portraying about what it means to be Christian and how we go about it?
And I agree with that. I'm totally sensitive to that.
All right.
And I think that, I can't speak for them, but I think that the, Reformed and the Catholic Christian nationalists would agree with that.
Okay.
That we need to be careful about that.
Yeah.
And keep first things
Yeah.
first.
Yeah.
But I guess I would point to the scriptural examples of Daniel with Nebuchadnezzar and then later Cyrus.
Yeah.
I would point to, that's the preeminent example, Daniel. But but also properly ordered magistrates who are aggressive on getting rid of paganism or evil life. There is an active sense of let's get done what can get done.
Amen. And I totally agree with that. Let's get done what can get done, and who's doing it. And so, so if a Christian wants to let's do this for the sake of God's morality, for the sake of the world, absolutely. We should all be doing that. We should, in other words, I should vote for those kinds of things. I vote for those kinds of candidates. I should be encouraging my people to think about these kinds of things and not just be kind of following the American way of, celebrating freedom and enhancing freedom. No, we should be enhancing God's morality.
So
I agree with you.
So you would, just to clarify, you would not disagree. I mean, let's throw out the word aggressive because that might have some negative connotations, but a very active, understanding of let's advance how far the word of God predominates in our society.
Yeah.
With the possible pitfalls.
No.
Being aware.
And I want to come back and talk about Christendom at some point.
Sure.
Just because we were talking a little bit last night, even and thinking about some of this, the pick your poison sort of thing. We'll come back to that. But should Christians be actively engaged in making the world the best it can possibly be? Absolutely. I believe that our theology as Lutherans should make us some of the most socially active people that there are. We don't have that heritage, which is weird.
At least not in America. But
in America, we don't have that heritage, but we should be socially active. And that doesn't mean just for conservative values, but it means for God's truth, for God's reality, fighting for God's justice.
All right, this is like a good middle point in this discussion. There's a lot to say here, I think, already. I can go first if nobody minds. So yeah, a lot of the discussion that's going to be from Bierman's end, most of his argument is related to Christian witness, and what he means by this seems to be how do those outside of the church view those inside of the church because of their external actions. And the idea is that if we are doing things that reflect poorly on us, reflect poorly on our character, that could be a stumbling block to those who are potential converts. So this is quite central to most of the points he's going to make. We're going to discuss self-defense later in the stream, and it will be quite central to that. And I think it's just important to keep in mind as you listen to the rest of this. Do you guys have any comments so far on this section?
Sure. I think a consideration that comes to mind is that, as you mentioned, Dr. Bierman is mentioning that we need to be sensitive to the witness that we are communicating to the world whenever we utilize the political magistrate to get things done. Because Dr. Bierman's concern here seems to be that if we communicate a bad witness, then we are going to stunt evangelism or prevent converts. But I think a relevant question to ask is whether or not the witness we are sending is bad simply because it is controversial, or because the things we are doing are bad. Because there are certainly moral issues which, as Christians, we should contend for. I mean, an uncontroversial one from our Christian side would be abortion, for instance. That should be something that Christians strive towards implementing through legislation, but nevertheless, that is considered from the world's perspective to be a bad witness. Like, many people in the world would say that is tarnishing the reputation of Christians, because they shouldn't be advocating for such a thing. So
Bierman admits as much. Dr. Bierman points that out.
Right, exactly. So that just goes to show, though, that there are certain instances where Christians should pursue certain legal changes, even though the world, from their perspective, would say that is a bad witness, even though it is harming the church's reputation from the perspective of the world. So if that is Dr. Bierman's only criteria of what the church should or should not pursue, then I think you have a problematic standard here.
There's also a core question here, which is, what do we mean when we say that the church has to give a good witness, especially in the information age? So if a bunch of Christians, quote unquote, take over a town, or let's just say everyone in the town is Christian, and they want to enact a blasphemy law, which, by the way, we do have a tradition of in America. Most of the colonies, if I'm not wrong, did have such things. And even once the country became more pluralistic, you still had, Christian movements or elements that were involved in debates about women's suffrage or debates about prohibition. So it's just false that we don't have a tradition of activism in the United States from the church.
And we also have in the colonies, a bunch of the colonies.
So, I mean, but you have to think a little bit creatively here about what does witness look like? So, there's examples from all over history of witness taking many different shapes besides just what does the guy down the street think of your denomination based on what the CTCR puts out or something like that. Like, you have, I forget the guy's name, but who was the Kievan Rus ruler who sent out the envoys and was like, let's just go see how other nations do things. And then then they went EO because they went to the Hagia Sophia and it was all pretty and shiny, many such cases. But you know what I mean? Like this is a sort of national, it didn't, just because they wanted to be, these other nations they were looking at were more or less monolithic, didn't impact their witness. Presumably the countries that they were visiting were quite great in their witness to the Kievan Rus by being exactly what they were. You could talk about other quote unquote witness opportunities as well. You could talk about Japan at the end of World War II and what was MacArthur's witness when he said, I could never tell them to be Christian because we have to have democracy there. So this is a key term that needs to be defined and explored if you're going to make serious arguments about this is a bad witness just because. And again, as I mentioned at the beginning, Dr. Bierman doesn't ever quite get down to brass tacks and saying like this specifically would be bad and this specifically would be good. But therein lies the rub. You have to kind of, I think when it comes down to brass tacks, you do have to talk about brass tacks.
Right.
Yeah. And one thing that they're going to get into later, we'll discuss this more when we get to self-defense and the specifics of that situation. But you have to consider both angles of this, because some of the world is going to look at the church and see it as weak and effeminate, and some of the world is going to look at the church and see it as patriarchalist and domineering. Oh, am I frozen?
I can hear you just fine.
Oh, you can hear me fine? I
Yeah.
don't know. No, maybe something on your end. I can send a message into the private chat. I'm gonna message him. Yeah, and doing any given action on self-defense issues, with respect to whether you defend yourself in the church or not, and how you go about defending yourself in the church, which is going to be paramount to the later discussion. That could go either direction on people who think the church is weak for turning the other cheek, or thinking the church is patriarchal and fascist for using lethal force in a situation, right, or something like that, right? Whatever it is, you can have people who are that might communicate not good witness on either side, and we need to make sure that we're not communicating false doctrine too. So if our actions are communicating that our belief is pacifism, we don't believe in pacifism, like the strict pacifism that you can never use defense, for example. Or if your beliefs are that the church's duty is to go out and police the streets as the church, like congregations should go out and try and police their communities as their Sunday job. That is also probably not what our doctrine is, right? In fact, it definitely is not our doctrine to on Sunday mornings go out and just police streets instead of having divine service. So you have to consider that you can fall into different pitfalls. You need to make sure you're confessing true doctrine, and you shouldn't be overly worried about one particular side of who you're bad witnessing to versus another.
Right. And also, presumably, there would be certain moral issues that Dr. Barron would say needs to be legislated and enforced, regardless of what the perceived witness is from the predominant culture. Yeah.
Right. All right, we'll continue on, and we'll have a discussion, because there's going to be a good section coming up next that I think people might have seen clips on if you followed any of this online on like X or other platforms. One of the more prominent clips comes up relatively soon.
And people kind of get squeamish about, oh, you're a social justice warrior. Well, I'm going to fight for justice, but God's going to define it, not what commonly people feel, or what the Enlightenment defines justice. Mm-hmm. Justice is defined by God, which is what adheres to His word. So yes, do I want God's word being advanced? Yes. Do I want God's morality being advanced? Yes. Would I love it if we could start having a law that says no more billboards that are sorted and
anti-pornography laws?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
That'd be great. And so I think we should pray for those things and work for those things. But is that my first task? And that's where we start getting into what role does it play in the integration of the estates. That's where
that's why I think the Lutheran conversation needs to be upped. And that's why I made it one of my 4 points about this conversation, not just here, but within Lutheranism in America, is so important.
I agree.
Because the voices right now, whether it be folk or Catholic or Reformed, I think would be the closest to magisterial or Reformed.
Yeah.
I know there's differences, but generally speaking, our voices need to be heard on this, because if we don't advance what we understand to be the truth, which is the truth, then we're going to leave the field to other people.
Amen.
Okay.
No, I completely agree with you. I am not advocating quietism.
Yeah.
I'm not advocating a pulling back like I said, circling the wagons. That's wrong. That's our first instinct.
Yeah.
You know, pull back. You know, the lake will be gone. Quiet, Lutherans.
Sure.
You know, you never say anything. Don't call any attention. While we don't need to call attention, we also can't forsake the field. But we have to be careful what we're doing in that field. Then.
Can I offer a friendly critique then?
Mm-hmm.
And that'll get into something specific. And that is, I went back and watched your, I think it was 2023 or 24 symposia.
Oh yeah. Mm-hmm.
Essay at the symposium, at the CSL symposium. And your paper was Christian Nationalism, and I don't remember the
Star Spangled Banner.
Star Spangled Banner. Okay, yeah,
Star
sure.
Spangled Luther.
Yeah, that was clever. Yeah, that's good. I never care about titles, but you guys always come up with either. Clever titles.
You know, my wife always tells me you have terrible titles.
Oh, really?
She comes up with titles.
No,
that one.
I do remember that. That's clever.
Yeah, that one I liked.
So, because I know we need grist for the grind here. You and I know I'm paraphrasing, but I think fairly. Correct me if I'm wrong. But you kind of laid out the doctrine of the two realms.
Yeah.
And then at the end, I don't remember exactly how you slid into it, but you basically made the assertion, and therefore any talk of Christian nationalism is an absurdity, or Christian nation is no good. And I don't think that's a helpful way to talk about it. Okay. I agree with all of your, hey, there's pitfalls here, there's temptations there, there's idols waiting in the wings. I agree with all of that. But I don't think rejecting which you obviously don't reject the idea of the ideal that I've been presenting, but at the same time, I think the Christian nationalist debate is important. So I have a hard time hearing this is an absurdity.
Okay. The absurdity is the idea that somehow we can make this happen, that this is the goal. And I hear too much of this rhetoric coming from those kinds of, we're going to make a Christian America. Well, what do you mean by that? What does this mean to you?
And who are you talking about?
Again, I'm talking about probably the folk versions of these things.
Okay.
The kinds of stuff you encounter on the 4th of July's and national holidays and that kind of stuff. And that's my concern. So is it fair? And if you're going to define Christian nationalism as we should be striving for a country that adheres to God's will, I won't disagree with that.
Right.
No, and if that's how we're defining Christian nationalism, but that's not how I don't think a lot of our people hear it that way necessarily.
Can I give some concretes? I think that might be helpful just to kind of.
Oh, sure.
I think before we hit the concretes, which they're about to do, this is a good spot before we hit the concretes. Earlier in the discussion, Bierman seemed to be on the page that the ideal is indeed a Christian magistrate. We skipped past this section, but he did seem to say at one point that the ideal is a Christian nation. But then he kind of seems to backpedal. Maybe he misspoke, but it's hard to tell. But it does seem to be, based on the rest of the discussion, that he probably is not misspeaking here. That the ideal of having a Christian nation is not really, I guess, realistic, or should not be this thing we're striving for. And this is categorically against what pretty much our dogmaticians say. And frankly, our confessions. Just take, for example, the treatise on the primacy and power and primacy of the Pope. This is on section 54. It says, "But especially the chief members of the church, kings and princes, ought to guard the interests of the church, and to see to it that errors be removed and consciences be healed, rightly instructed. As God expressly exhorts kings in Psalm 210, be wise now, therefore, O ye kings, be instructed, ye judges of the earth." And as a side note, that verse is quoted a bunch in our dogmaticians. "For it should be the first care of kings and great lords to advance the glory of God." Note, the first care of them is to advance the glory of God. "Therefore, it would be very shameful for them to lend their influence and power to confirm idolatry and infinite other crimes, and to slaughter saints." And there are numerous quotes like this from our dogmaticians about how the magistrate is involved in sacred manners with respect to external observance, being a practicing and believing Christian themselves, that is one of their first duties, external governance of the church, funding the church, helping with calling ministers, taking counsel from the teachers of the church, You have in Andrea, you have this quote that is very good. And Andrea is one of the authors of the Formula of Concord. And he says, from which it is understood, I'm beginning in the middle of a paragraph, from which it is understood that it is not foreign to the office of kings and princes that they themselves also oversee the churches and ensure that they are taught rightly, so that the hearts of men may be bent toward the true invocation of God and toward other duties of piety, and that they forbid the worship of idols and the teaching and confirmation of false opinions opposed to the gospel, no matter from what kind of people they are spread. And you find the exact same type of thing in Naxkow, who's a late dogmatician, saying that no other religion other than the true Christian religion should be tolerated in the country. And unless it cannot be removed without danger or peril of offense and revolution. So, if you were to become president today, and you were to sign an executive order, would it be prudent to say you cannot be any religion other than confessional Lutheran? That would probably result in mass uproar in the United States. I can imagine not a few Baptists being, very angry at this, right? And it would probably cause public disruption and would not be good for the tranquility and order of the state. So you have to use prudence here, but both Ramirez and Bierman are obviously quite concerned with prudence. They've made that clear so far. I don't think either of them was in favor of such a law right now that would be a good idea. But nonetheless, this is ideally the goal, according to our dogmaticians. This is the end goal, is that you would have true religion enforced in the external observance of both tables of the law. And that should be done through the magistrate. That's what our dogmaticians say. No, do you have any comments?
Yeah. So Dr. Bierman's rebuttal to this is going to be, as he says in the video, well, that was back in Saxony. And, back in those days, you could get away with stuff like that because, everyone valued unity. Well, in the US, we value religious liberty. So it would cause immense scandal to try to implement something like this. Part of that can be answered when you actually take on another premise, which I know Dr. Bierman shares because he says so in the video, which is that we actually don't value religious pluralism in this country. That's incoherent. We do have a national religion, which is a perversion of Christianity, where the soul is replaced with personal autonomy and identity. Excommunication is replaced with canceling. Eschatology is replaced with, let's say, the climate crisis or whatever. Right. So it is a religion. You've got saints, you've got a cult of the saints, you've got everything. So we actually just simply live under a something of a demonic theocracy, if you're going to take it in the most extreme direction. So is it going to cause offense to try to convert a nation that follows a false religion to the true religion? It might, the same way that it would cause offense to heretics in unified Saxony to forbid them to preach. So unless you're going to draw some Sorites line in the sand and say, oh, if you give offense to 51% of the population, that's when it becomes unadvisable. I don't think that there's a really good objection here.
And to be clear, this is not speaking about freedom of conscience, which all our dogmaticians believe in. They refute the papists who do not believe in freedom of conscience. But freedom of conscience is not the same as public exercise of religion or the magistrate protecting other religions or anything like that. Freedom of conscience.
This is an important thing that,
yeah,
we will have to have that conversation at some point, because there is sort of a prevailing idea, I think, under some Christian nationalist thinkers or like right-wing / conservative Christians, broadly speaking. There's sort of this perception that, well, the Catholics were really good at drawing the line at public enforcement of outward behavior, but the Catholics didn't go into the inner heart and try to police that. That was a Puritan thing. The Puritans were the ones who would punish you for even thinking something bad. And what Seth just read or summarized from the dogmaticians tells against that. The suggestion from them is that no, Rome didn't actually respect the conscience. So, but that's a bigger conversation to have.
Yeah, and Kalov specifically addresses that issue of freedom of conscience and says that the Roman Catholics are the one who are the ones who are trying to impose on the consciences of men. But there's a difference, of course, between conscience and public exercise, or conscience and public preaching, and conscience and government protection, or even tax breaks, for example, which is probably the more relevant one to our current example in the US. Is, if we're being honest, in realistic situations, tax breaks for churches. Like, if you were a Christian magistrate, could you selectively enforce tax breaks for Christianity as opposed to, say, Islam or another religion? I think you could do that in the US without disrupting public order. Now, maybe I'm wrong, but I think it's possible.
Oh, sure.
Get
Yeah.
to. So,
yeah.
you know, and maybe in each of these, you can kind of think of, is that an ideal? And then second, because I think all of these are ones that you could be actively working towards. So in other words, should we as the church be actively working in this? So I'll lay the 4 out, and I'd kind of like to hear, because they're.
Can I actually clarify something before you go on?
Yeah, go for it.
Obviously, when the church works, they work. Every Christian works individually and corporately. But I just want to understand that whatever you ask, when you say the church, it's not necessarily the official synod or something, but Christians properly working it out according to their own vocations.
Yeah. In the same way, maybe not to the same degree, but in a close to second degree, you know, we are all united around a certain confession. And should that confession then lead to kind of all of us, should we all be agreed on, like, these should be active goals that we're working towards? Not saying LCMS creates a task force or Trinity Lutheran Church picks up the banner, but
well, I mean, the task force never do anything. So.
Well, that's true.
It's not quite.
You said it.
Yeah.
No, that's why we have them.
Yes. Yeah.
Looks good on paper.
So here's a couple examples. So, you know, kind of immigration is certainly a question here that's being like actively discussed in our country, right?
Yep.
And it is very fair to say, and we've talked with, even on the podcast, we've talked with some kind of missionary types that are in the Twin Cities, in certain areas that have been overtaken by Muslim populations. And they will say without a doubt, you go to convert the Muslims and you always lose, and they actually end up converting a lot of your people. Like, they're very militant on this. So there's no doubt that if I did not live here in Waconia, but I lived 25 miles east, that there would be a real danger of my children, people in my church and in my community being converted to Islam, right? And it's also true, therefore, that if we tomorrow sent all the Muslims back to the country that they came from, wherever that is, that threat to our own people would be taken away, right? So our children would be much safer. Okay. So my question is, maybe we can just start with that one, and then we can go down to some of these other ones. But like, for that one, is that something that, you know, that we should be really having a conversation with? Of course, we want to evangelize, but that question is that something that we should be thinking about too, as we're kind of shipping people with other ideologies into our communities that are changing both the moral and the theological structure? And I'll start with you, Joel.
And you'll start with me. Okay. Yeah, I haven't thought about that specific instance. But I thought about the immigration thing and the whole idea of, you know, what is it, you know, what are we trying to create, you know, a perfect kind of world. So my first reaction is that I'm not afraid of Islam, and I don't think we need to be afraid of the interaction with them. God's truth wins out. Now, can people be very compelling, and, you know, the social interactions and the personal interactions matter? Sure. But as a parent and as a pastor, I think there are plenty of things I can do in a predominantly Muslim context that would, I'm not be afraid by that. And so my second thought would be, is the solution to ship them all home? No. I tend to be very against the idea of kind of clamping down borders for the sake of preserving our American heritage, whatever that is. I think that's a little bit misguided. So I'm not a huge fan of that whole mentality, because I think, and I'm not saying let them in so we can evangelize them. I'm not under any illusions about how easy that's going to be. But I do know that God calls us to witness to those who are around us, and whoever shows up around me, I will witness God's truth to them, and however I can do that, whether I'm, you know, surrounded by a Muslim context, or I have just one Muslim neighbor, or I'm living in prison, or wherever I happen to be in my context, I witness to God's reality without fear. So no, I'm not a huge fan of, you know, clamping down on immigration laws to try to make a safer country for my kids or other my parishioners.
Okay. And the reason.
Well, there's the quote, the clip that people may have seen. There's a lot to say on this one. Samuel, do you want to go first?
Sure. I mean, just briefly, he says there that he's not particularly in favor on clamping down on immigration for the safety of his neighbor or his kids, but that seems prima facie to simply contradict the final cause of the magistrate, which is to promote the final good. The common good, and that would include the common good of both family and neighbor. So, yeah.
I'm pretty baffled by him saying that he doesn't know what a Christian heritage in America is, or for the exact wording he uses, but American heritage or American culture or Christian culture in America. America has a pretty big history with, being Christian, as it turns out. I think most people know this. There are many perversions of Christianity in the US, and it has a troubled history with a lot of, frankly, unusual groups. But the fact that it has historically been plurality professing Christian is, I think, no news to anyone. So I'm frankly baffled by what he means by this. In the days of the colonies, we had state churches, and some of those state churches remained into the time of the Constitution. So it wasn't like, we didn't have established religion in states by the magistrate under our current Constitution, and under our Bill of Rights too. It was only later that that the state churches get dissolved. So we do have a Christian heritage in the U.S. The state, or the population, since before the time of the Constitution, since before the time of the Articles of Confederation or even the Revolution, has been plurality Christian. The populace has been plurality Christian since the beginning, since the time of Columbus, or even the time of the Vikings when they came over into Canada, which maybe isn't America, I guess, but the New World has been Christian from the start in terms of the plurality religion of the people who are living here. And that also was reflected in the magistrates, where they had state churches in the colonies. And under British rule, there was obviously the state church of England, and territories that were controlled by France had Roman Catholic rule in areas. So there is a history of, being Christian in the States, obviously. And so it's pretty bizarre to me that he seems to be ignorant or feigning ignorance on that topic. In terms of American culture, I mean, there's a lot of American culture that I think is worth preserving, Christian or not. I mean, think of the great musical heritage in our marches in the Romantic era. I think of Dvorak when he comes over and writes the Symphony from the New World, which is obviously inspired by America and the places he visits. I think of literature that comes from the U.S., such as Atala by Chateaubriand, who's one of my favorite authors. But I also think of rich American literary heritage, even in terms of things that aren't particularly Christian, frankly, but just sort of good literature. And a modern example, perhaps relevant because a lot of people have seen the movie, something like Dune. I think Dune is a great work of science fiction. I think it actually has lots of good lessons in it, honestly, even though it's a science fiction book that is written for a general audience. I think it has lots of stuff in there that's good, a lot of good takeaways, and it's just enjoyable to read, and it's good literature. We have a lot of rich history in the U.S., and I think, and in America, even before it was the U.S., when it was the colonies and was just settlers. I think we have a lot of great history that comes out of it, and I think it's worth preserving as a culture.
Yeah, there's a sort of damned if you do, damned if you don't standard here. Like, okay, what's your test for if something is hurting our witness? Okay, so let's say we implement X government and the church grows in membership. Well, that doesn't count as helping our witness because, when the church is really thriving, well, there's a lot of hypocrites. Okay, well, let's try something else. Well, the church is shrinking now, but supposedly, and it's true, when there's persecution, it's harder to be a hypocrite, but the church is literally shrinking. So what's the standard here for which sort of government helps our witness or not? So, I mean, you can look at Muslim countries, right? So there are plenty of Muslim countries that are very strong in terms of their religious enforcement. You can't, I think Saudi Arabia, right? You can't publicly profess Christianity. Does that hurt the Muslim witness? Probably not. It probably actually helps the Muslim witness. Now you might say that, well, Islam is a militant religion and Christianity is different. Okay, well, you still need some kind of standard. And this gets back to Ramirez saying, I'll take the possible hypocrites, sort of like Walther would say about the gospel, right? You preach the gospel, some people are going to have cheap grace, and you just have to bite that bullet. I can't imagine like desiring to have a time of persecution. That's absurd to me.
Yeah, part of the dichotomy that is set up in the whole discussion, and there'll be more of this evidence as we continue, is that Bierman and Ramirez agree that there are pitfalls and benefits to having a more Christianized state and a state that is not as top-down on enforcement of external observance of the law. They both acknowledge pitfalls and benefits to both sides.
I also want to say, oh, sorry.
I was just going to say, but Bierman is under the impression that the benefits of having a not Christian state outweigh the pitfalls of that. And his chief example of this is, for example, in Denmark with Soren Kierkegaard. And Kierkegaard says that the churches are full, but everyone's hypocrites. And Bierman thinks it's better to be able to identify people who are and aren't genuine Christians by, kind of, I guess, getting out the hypocrites, because in a non-Christian state, hypocrites leave the church. And he thinks that benefit outweighs the benefits of having a Christian magistrate who enforces external observance of the law. That's what seems to be his position.
It's almost like there's a presumption here that the church in America isn't persecuted, and that we're sort of in this free marketplace of ideas where like everything's equal and the truth will win out. But even the more concerning presupposition that I notice here is, let's just bracket questions of blasphemy and divine judgment and first table of the law. Let's just consider what Dr. Bierman is calling order matters, or second table of the law matters. So the question was raised, should we bar Muslims from the country to keep things safer? Dr. Bierman did not deny Ramirez's premise that it makes things more dangerous. And yet he says, I'm not really concerned with that, even as a matter of safety. That seems to go against the presumption that we would want to be keeping things safer. I suppose the possible refutation here is if you can find any country that's had mass Muslim immigration that has not gotten less safe. And frankly, this is something the left and the right should be able to agree on. It's very odd to be seeing, I mean, this is a meme at this point, but to be seeing the left in the US allying with the Muslims in, let's say Michigan or frankly, more and more places now. They should study the Iranian Revolution and what the blacks did to the Reds after they toppled the Shah. Like, it does not end well for anybody. So this is merely a good order question, and that's all it is. And it seems incoherent what his position.
Yeah, and just to be clear here, the defense and safety of the people is a chief duty of the magistrate. I did a Control F for DEFEN, defend, for defense or defend, things like that in our political compen that we're working on, which isn't quite finished, but I have most of the work done in there, more, probably 80-90% of it. And I got 118 hits, and almost all of those are about protecting the citizenry, including from false religions, by the way. And they do have in mind the Turks who are Muslims. So this is explicitly addressed by our dogmaticians. Should you be, bringing Muslims into your country? Should you be allowing that? Should they be crossing the borders? Well, here's Hallatz. Whoever is angry with his brother rashly is guilty before divine judgment, but whoever is enraged against an enemy who dares to endanger either the liberty of citizens or religion and drives him from the borders of the country is moved by just indignation. And again, he says the ultimate and primary purpose of the magistrate is the glory of God, and the intermediate and secondary purposes is the public good. And he continues on to say, The magistrate protects the interests of citizens and drives back external enemies from the borders of the homeland. And I could provide so many of these that there are countless. Like I said, 118 hits for this, and it's just all over. The magistrate must protect the citizens. He must be a destroyer of idolatry, according to Selnecker, again, a writer of one of our confessions. He says Selnecker says this, the defense and protection of states is commanded to all, that is, commanded to all people, to all, for 4 reasons. That you have peace, that in peace you have true doctrine of God, and that's propagated, that the fatherland is defended with honorable laws, discipline, pursuit of piety and integrity, and that the wicked are punished and removed. So, and like I said, I could go on with any number of quotes. There are hundreds of these. This is just unambiguously ubiquitous in our dogmaticians, that this is one of the primary purposes of the magistrate. So this cannot be overstated.
I don't know if we're going to get to this clip or not, but one of the arguments here is, well, let's say if you deport a jihadist from the country, he's someone who could hear the gospel, right? And we have to keep that in mind. We really should distinguish different senses of could here. Could a guy who has 14 convictions on a crime potentially reform his ways? Sure. Could someone who says death to all Christians potentially be converted? Sure. But in matters of civil morality, those are sort of not bets that the magistrate can make, maybe to an extent, but you've got to play the odds at a certain point and say, sorry, you're going home. Like, you're a danger to this country. So the mere fact that there's, a 1% chance of someone's conversion is not a good argument for leaving them all around.
Right. Let's continue, because there is a little bit more relevant in this discussion. And then if we want to move on to a later section in the video, we can. But I think there's a little more that's relevant here, because I think they dive a little deeper.
The reason I use that example, just to kind of clarify, and then Dave, if you want to go, but one, I'm thinking of the Luther with the Anabaptists.
Yeah.
And I'm trying to think of what would a modern day situation for that look like. And then just knowing some of you can see it more so in Britain, but certainly in Minneapolis, close to here, like there's areas where Christendom has been
but the difference is, though, Luther's living in a little city in a Saxon state where it is Christian. Everybody, the prince is Christian. They're all, and the question is, are you Lutheran or Baptist or Catholic? But they're all kind of there. And so Luther's saying, for the sake of unity, which was still valued a lot then, we don't see it the same way anymore since the Peace of Augsburg. That's changed that. But he's living in a state where, we need to do this for the sake of everybody. We don't live there. And so should we be striving for that? I think it hurts our witness when we start trying to fight for those kinds of laws.
Okay. Dave?
Yeah, this is probably a good point of difference, because I would first, of course, say that a question like that is going to depend on circumstances, and it is a matter of wisdom. The particular solutions, Christians of goodwill can disagree on that. Yet at the same time, I guess I would still hold as an ideal Luther's understanding of territorialism, which was common back in that day. We're so far away from that that would be a generational project, unless a situation,
generations probably.
Unless there's new circumstances and big shakeups, politically,
collapse of Western culture.
Yeah, sure. Which, who knows? So right. But I still would assert that territorialism is the ideal. And I also do think that we have to take seriously Luther, and I would say the scriptures, understanding of, if you tolerate public open blasphemy, you are going to call down God's curses. Not to mention, I know that this is mixing apples and oranges to a certain extent, but the Israelites did not send their kids to Canaanite schools. You know what I mean?
Right.
Like,
right.
They did not say, hey, and I know you're not saying this, but they did not say, let's have more Canaanites or Moabites or Ammonites immigrate to our country so we can evangelize them. I mean, that's like suicidal, basically. So
just so the audience knows, there is a small treatise by Valentin Ernst Leischer on whether the state should have explicitly Christian education and how that should be executed. And Leischer is in the affirmative that the state should have Christian education and that it should be done according to Lutheran principles and that the public should be attending said Christian schools. So yes, having Christian schools from the top level by the state is something that our dogmaticians have supported. And yes, that treatise will be included in the convent.
I'm gonna go out on a limb and say that they did send their kids to Canaanite schools. You don't intermarry with pagans and then avoid some of the wives saying, "Hey, let's take a Baal class, let's take an Asherah class here and there." I mean, that's just not plausible. So
yeah,
that's
and actually,
only a historical point. I know what he's getting at.
There's evidence of that probably in some of the scriptures actually too, with some of the theological polemics that go on in the Bible, right? You see, for example, like near quotes of the Baal cycle going on in some spots of scripture where they're flipping it for a polemic and saying, hey, Yam or Baal, these figures aren't the true God, but rather Yahweh or, everyone, Jehovah, to use the more traditional pronunciation. Jehovah is the true God. The Lord is the true God. And so they do know the Canaanite religions near them. They are quite familiar with them actually. And it's not good that they're sending their kids to the Canaanite schools, so to speak.
That's the problem. Yeah.
So I personally think it is certainly within the realm of Christian discourse to say, hey, as a Christian people, or at least as a formerly Christian people, or people that are looking towards a renewed Christendom, what should we do with people who refuse to outwardly conform and are uttering wicked blasphemies and committing pagan crime? Well, not pagan, but immoral crimes against the populace here.
Mm-hmm. Well, see, then the question is, what do you mean by formerly Christian? What is, who's passing this law for what reason?
Oh, absolutely.
And is it just racially motivated, jingoistic kind of, American supreme, preserving our American thing? All those things get rolled into this. Yeah, and so as a Christian, my goal is always to say, how do I witness God's reality the best way I can in the context?
Absolutely. And
since buffering, I figure I'd jump in real quick. We did have a Muslim ban on immigration just under the previous Trump administration. So and I didn't see any like wild backlash against the church for it or something. So if Bierman's worried about Christian Witness for having, say, a Muslim ban on immigration, we literally just had this in the US. And there wasn't rioting in the streets. And this is coming from someone who lives next to Dearborn, Michigan. I don't recall any rioting from Muslims in Dearborn, despite that city being dominated by Muslims and the signs being in Arabic. And I don't recall any rioting in Minneapolis where they have calls to prayer for Muslims in the cities. I mean, I'm sure they were unpleased, but in terms of just keeping good order and peace and Christian witness, this didn't seem to be problematic at all. And I don't recall there being any mass disorder because of the Muslim bans that Trump had instituted that we just had a few years ago.
There's lots of both legitimate points on that, you know what I mean? In terms of what is the ethnic makeup of a community? Is that, is there too much plurality for cohesion? That's a legitimate topic.
That's a legitimate question.
Yeah. There's also motivation, like you said. Is it just jingoistic? Is it reaching back for something that never existed?
Right.
Or is it actually, hey, these are these circumstances. These are just outward horrible things. And even if we were formerly a broadly speaking Christian people, we're still seeking to recover that. I think those are all legitimate discussions, and they need to also be done with the eye of not just how do we give a good witness to the non-Christians, but how do we protect our own people? I agree with Professor Bierman about, I'm not scared about debating Muslims. I totally agree with that. Yet at the same time, if a religious population is committing crimes, like in Britain is the classic example with the Muslim rape gangs.
Well, that's a different issue altogether.
Sure. But I mean, the Somalis, I'm assuming that's what we're talking about in Minneapolis, have brought incredible amounts of crime. And I think that's something where you say, hey, yes, we need to bear a good witness, but also we need to give a good witness to our children, our grandchildren. And so I do think preserving not just an orderly society, but a more Christian society is important.
Well, orderly society, absolutely. That's government's job. As far as a Christian society, well, what do you mean by Christian? And that's where we need to get on to talking about Christendom a little bit,
sure,
and what that actually means by that. And we'll get there, I'm sure. But see, the church's ideal is every race, tribe, and nation all come together under the confession of Jesus as Lord. And so the idea that we need to preserve our ethnicity, there's something to be said for being the cohesion that comes from living life together, and having the same holidays, the same ways of operating. When you have people have different holiday celebrations, it's weird. It creates dissonance. And yet in the church, we find our unity around our common confession of Christ. That's what brings us together. And so to me, the Christian ideal that we're striving for is not a homogenization of everybody into an American way of being, but the ability to be able to say, look, these different languages, these different cultures, these different music styles, these different ways of living, these different ways of dressing, these are all part of God's wonderful creation. And we can all delight in these things together under the unity of our common confession of Christ.
And I agree with that. I just don't, and I know you are big into not over realizing eschatology.
Right.
And so, but here in this life, these are legitimate discussions about how much diversity can happen in one community.
And how much plurality can you allow before you start to disintegrate it.
Right.
And we're living in the disintegration. I agree with that.
Yeah, because any pluralistic society ultimately winds up as a rather unified, homogenous society.
Correct.
Over time.
Or it's not going to survive.
Yeah. So I think those are all legitimate questions. So I guess to answer your question directly, obviously, how would you do this? How would you make criteria? All that kind of stuff is very complex. But in terms of a Christian people, again, whatever that means, but a Christian people saying, listen, we are going to draw the line and say, if you are a Muslim, I know there's lots of prudential steps to get there, but to say, hey, if you're a Muslim, either you need to convert or you need to leave. I think that's totally on the table. It's not on the table right here and right now necessarily. And I don't think it's off the table in terms of discussing. I mean, Spain had to deal with this.
Well, no, it did. But see, I think that would be off the table. I wouldn't want that. To say because you are a Muslim, you can't live here. I don't think that would be
in all circumstances. There's no circumstance where that would
I have a hard time thinking of a time when I would say that's a good thing to do.
Well, I mean, let's use Spain.
Yeah.
Okay. I mean, I think Spain had good reason to do that. I mean, the Muslims were cooperating with Muslim pirates from North Africa, raiding, enslaving people on the Mediterranean coast.
And see, but then now you're into ordered issues. And it's not just an issue of because of your faith you're doing this, but it's because of what your actions.
But they're kind of intertwined.
They do. No one is an isolated thing.
Yeah.
And they all get intertwined. But I think we need to be careful that we make sure we're doing it for the order, morality reasons, and not for the ethnic kinds of reasons.
Well, I'm bringing up the blasphemy issue.
The blasphemy issue. And see, and that's where, and yes, it would be great if we could have keep people from doing what is wrong, even in the first table.
Yeah.
Right. But again, do I exile them or kick them out? I'd be really reluctant to start being too aggressive in that. I'd have to look at the circumstances and think about what's happening morally, what's happening for the sake of the community.
I think all of those topics are, and we talked a little bit yesterday and before about maybe a generational difference.
Yeah.
But like, just to throw out kind of an example, like when I hear about a 50-foot golden statue of a Hindu god or goddess, in Texas, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
I mean, that to me puts those questions on the table.
Okay.
In the call to.
All right. That's like a good example. They kind of discussed this more, but that is the gist of what goes on in this conversation here about preservation of culture, preservation of religion in the U.S., public worship from other religions, and things like that. And this also gets to some of the questions that in chat are there. One is that would it be prudent for a Christian magistrate to deport those Muslims? Another one is, should a common race be considered a good for society? So these are questions about whether the Christian magistrate should try to unify the society based on, say, ethnicity or race or religion, whether that's a good thing for the Christian magistrate to do. Just to give some quotes on this, in terms of nations and cohesion, the Bible does actually speak on this some. For example, Jeremiah states in Jeremiah 13:23, "Can the Ethiopian change his skin or the leopard its spots?" So Jeremiah recognizes that you can't just change certain realities about yourself. And Sirach says in 13, verses 15 to 16, "Every beast loveth his like, and every man loveth his neighbor. All flesh consorteth according to kind, and a man will cleave to his like." And Sirach isn't even necessarily making a positive assertion about what this entails and should happen, but it's just saying that the matter of the fact that this is how people are. And God has, put the nations where they are and appointed their dwelling place, one blood for every nation, right? As it says in Acts 17. So this is the reality of things. And the Bible does speak in generalities. Everyone knows Cretans are always liars, right? Evil beasts and lazy gluttons, as it says in Titus. So, is Paul saying every single individual? No, probably not. He's just making a generality about groups. But groups are groups, and they do cling to themselves, whether you like it or not. And so that is a political reality you have to deal with. And Ramirez is contending that we should strive for unity in these things, and that when he introduce disunity, he says it's inevitable that either they will have a sort of ethnogenesis into a new group, or they will simply be at odds with each other and have disunity, and this will result in perhaps war, or at the very least strong political disagreements, which is perhaps what we see today, very strong political disagreements, even resulting in violence, which, is maybe not at war yet necessarily, but, it can always go in that direction. And so in order to maintain public peace and order, one does have to ask, should we be trying to, just introduce pluralism into society for some hypothetical good of pluralism, or is it the best to seek the peace and order of the nation by not introducing so many differences in religion and ethnicity and race and other things that people unite upon? And if people want some more quotes too, for example, Herder, Johann Gottfried Herder is a big, he's a Lutheran pietist, but he's a Lutheran pietist pastor from the 18th century. And he does talk about, for example, every nation having it in itself the scale of its perfection that's incomparable with any other group. And so he's not saying better or worse. He's just saying that each group has its unique things that are ideal to it, and that is not the same from east or west or north or south. It is contingent on the historical realities and the peculiarities of national cultures and historical eras, and that this is simply how things are. People love their countries and their manners, their languages. People love their families, and not necessarily even because they're the best in the world, but because they are his own. And he loves himself and his own and labors in them. And this is you can find a lot of this in Herder's outlines of a philosophy of the history of man. And he actually discusses the issue of immigration, to be clear, and says that it is often problematic when you have immigration because people go to new places and that they're not adjusted to it. They're not climatized to it. They have a hard time integrating and things like this, and that this is often a negative for the people who are moving and for the people to whom the person is moving towards.
Yeah, I mean, a good example of this would be the way that I think it's arguable that America had an ethnogenesis moment when you had Anglos, right, English, Yankee types, and then you had Germans mix in, then you had Celts mix in, and you can still see those, those different sort of cultural or ethnic traits in different regions of the country, and even in terms of like who's more in combat positions in the military, who's more in this or that sort of business based on what the people were used to doing for their jobs. So, yeah, I don't have a lot else on that. I would kind of like to talk about that one question about spiritual tasks in nations. It's kind of going off of it.
It's like that's by its necessity Christian. And the third is a little bit different, but do nations themselves have God-given spiritual tasks? And we can unpack that one. I'm guessing we won't jump to that one first. So I'll open that up. Joel, I don't know if you want to take one of these.
They get to that. They get to actually the question later, but they don't end up answering it. But I thought it was an interesting question, and I was reflecting on this, and an example that I think is helpful here is sort of the way that different cultures will look at laws. So in Middle Eastern, North African societies, and someone can correct from the chat if they think this is incorrect, but what you get is like a lot of laws that are just supposed to sort of describe what it's like to be a normal person. So you have a lot of laws, a lot of regulations, but no one takes them super seriously. And in more northern cultures, like let's say Britain, or maybe Gaul or Germany, or the Swedish, or sorry, Scandinavian ethnicities, there's like fewer laws, but they're really important. So the problem with that becomes, well, what happens when, let's say, Egyptian patristic texts make it all their way to Ireland? It's like, holy cow, all of a sudden you have this more northern temperament of less laws taken very seriously, and now they have all these laws, maybe in terms of monastic piety or daily piety or whatever, and they're taking them super seriously, and that leads to a sort of crisis. Arguably, this was an element of the Reformation, and why the more northern parts of Europe had a real problem with all the Catholic laws. Now that might be a little speculative, but the idea here is that God can use the unique traits of people to accomplish his ends. So, for example, like, some of it is a little sillier, but I think there's a grain of truth in it. Like, is there a reason that the Renaissance happened in Italy and not in Iceland? Is there a reason why the Reformation happened in Germany and not in Egypt? I think there is. And I think that's really interesting, because you can see the hand of God sort of working through history here. It also sort of brings up, okay, this is like a liability if we're going to import tons of Muslims who think about morality this way and try to combine it with the way Americans think about morality. There's a lot of chaos that's possibly going to result from that. So I think that that's a way to sort of bring the two kingdoms together. If you insist on thinking in a two kingdoms way, it's like the spiritual is directly affected by the civil. The way that you think about just daily life is going to affect the way that you receive the faith. And people who have worked at evangelizing places that are far away, like let's say India or Islamic communities, to whatever extent that's possible, they recognize this. Like, you have to understand that culture and the liabilities of trying to blend two cultures into one. I don't know if you guys have thoughts on that.
I don't know if I have any more unique thoughts other than what has already been said. I do think we have to keep in mind, that different places are simply different. And divine providence has given different gifts unequally to different areas. And so for example, the strict following of laws might be viewed, in one way as a great gift in, say, northern European cultures, like you were saying, this strict, I guess you could say, high conscientiousness. In the right context, this would breed, formidable observance of external laws, right? But when this becomes problematic is when you have a system that gets introduced, like you said, an overbearing number of laws, and this ends up with a form of legalism. Just and this is an example. You could apply this to so many different cultures and different contexts. But I like that one. It's a good one. And you have to be very observant of that if you are a really a leader in any context, but especially in the magistrate or in the church, that this is a reality of the world, that places are different, and that this is simply how things will always be. And probably no amount of just introducing multiculturalism everywhere will ever truly change this. You will have new ethnogeneses in different areas in such a case. Do we want to skip to self-defense section?
Yeah, that sounds good.
All right, we'll skip over there. I know Noah has to go soon too, but we can skip over there at least.
I don't even know what that means. So
yeah.
It's like, okay. Yeah. So I guess by way of introduction to bring this up, you had spoken about a very shocking examples or parallel examples about how Christians or the church can give witness.
Yeah.
And I think you did this in Michigan.
Okay.
I have some buddies in Michigan who listened to your presentation, but I also saw some clips floating around on the internet on this. And since I did actually do some homework, I figured I should, I think it might be interesting to bring this up in terms of what you mean by what's a better witness.
No, the witness is the key part of this. That's fine.
Yeah, I'm fascinated in the example, but if you want to give the example.
Well, I was at the district convention for Michigan District, and I was talking about the unique task of the church, providing a witness to the world in spite of the world's decadence and pressure we're getting from the world. We have this opportunity to provide this witness, and it had just happened within 24 hours of when I gave my presentation. It was just right there, because I think I was there on a Monday and it had happened on a Sunday. So there was a congregation in the Detroit area where a guy had come, crazy guy, armed to the teeth, and was going to go in and shoot up a church. And he got spotted in the parking lot, got run over by some guy with his car.
Because he had guns out or something.
Yeah, he had guns out, belts, gun belts and everything, and the whole thing. And so he got run over. But then the security detail from that congregation, it was an evangelical church, came out and liquidated him. They shot him, they killed him.
Yeah.
And they were low key about it. Nobody wanted to admit who had done it, but it was the church's security detail that did that. And so that went down. And then within almost at that exact same time, because it was Sunday evening in Syria, there was a congregation that Muslim extremists came in and shot up people and blew up the congregation, and like 20 some people died. And so I just raised the question, what witness was given in each such situation? And what's that look like? And I just left it as an open question. What do you think? What are we witnessing? My concern is that when the church is protecting herself and trying to take care of herself and demanding her rights and demanding her fair share and trying to assert her place, I think it becomes counterproductive to the witness she gives, because then we start to look like the rest of the world. We start to look like everybody else looks. We're not being the distinct reality of a new way of being that we follow Christ and what that actually looks like. That's my concern. And so the witness, I think, given by the martyrs who were made in that congregation in Syria, it's tragic and it's sad and it's horrible. And we don't want that for any of our people. And yet they're willing to say, we gather for worship. And if people do this to us, we don't retaliate. We don't have a plan in place to, kill them first, in a sense. And that's kind of the point, I guess. And so that to me gets to the idea of the witness. What are we witnessing? Are we witnessing Christian muscle? Are we witnessing Christian force? Are we witnessing Christian ability to take on things and win? That's just, I think, it's the totally wrong mentality. The witness we have following Christ is, he's my Lord. He's my protector. I'm going to follow him. I'm going to do things his way, and he'll take care of the rest. That to me is the core of witness.
So I guess there's two things in response. One, when I heard you give this example, something struck me as interesting, that only 20 people died, because from my understanding of Syrian Orthodox Christians, they have bigger congregations than 20 people.
There were like 60 injured. So
right. I know. Yeah. And so I was interested in that because, and I dug into it a little bit more, because the Orthodox typically are fine defending themselves.
Mm.
Now, Christians, from my understanding, aren't allowed to have guns, or very, very strict gun laws over in Syria.
Yeah.
But I dug into it and I read the homily by the patriarch who came and did the funeral service.
Oh, okay.
And it was interesting because I know you can still make your broader theological point.
Yeah.
But just for your information, he preached a sermon and they did not just allow that guy to come in.
Mm.
Young men actually stopped this crazy, tackled him, knew that he was trying to get into the sanctuary, didn't let him get all the way in.
That's great.
There was like 250 people in there.
Yeah, okay.
So they did actively, violently resist. The only reason why it didn't go down like in Michigan was because they didn't have firearms.
Yeah.
But they did actively resist. And the patriarch was like, these guys are heroes for doing this.
Okay.
So,
well, I'll clarify this then. So the stopping somebody from doing evil, that's fine. I'm not saying, here I am, shoot me. So in other words, can I say, can I duck? Can I tackle him? Can I stop him from causing harm? That's fine. To me, it's taking the lethal resistance becomes the kind of the upping the game a little bit. And that's my concern.
Okay.
I don't know why my mic can't hear. Oh, my mic.
Are we paused or buffering?
I paused. I figured it is the business discussion right there, right?
Yep,
Yeah.
That's good enough.
Yeah, really.
He does go on to mention that he would be okay with subduing the attacker, but only under the qualification that it would be with non-lethal force.
Yeah, he's the language he uses specifically is to use the baseball bat and not the firearm.
He would be okay with tackling the intruder or the attacker, but not utilizing lethal force to immobilize the same.
So there's a couple things wrong with this, even by his logic. So we can assume his premises and say, where does it lead us? So Dr. Bierman concedes that the state may use lethal force, right? The state may use lethal force. The state can even delegate that lethal force to police. But it seems the state cannot delegate that lethal force to the average citizen, even though in the United States, where you have self-defense laws in case of death or great bodily harm, such authority is in fact delegated. So that argument, if it's strictly based on lethal force authority and delegation, that's incoherent. Now he's going to bring in another premise here about something specific to Christians not killing in particular. And that might be a slightly different argument. But even then, there would be problems with it. I'll let you guys jump in, I guess.
Right.
Yeah,
Another problem that there is with this argument is that Dr. Joel Bierman is suggesting that the reason why Christians cannot or should not use lethal force is because it does not communicate the message of Christ. Of course, Christ tells us to turn the other cheek and so forth. And Dr. Bierman argues that if we were to use lethal force, that would be contradicting the witness of Christ. But the problem with this argumentation is that he is in support of, tackling the intruder or attacking him with a baseball bat or using other physical means to subdue or immobilize an attacker. But those instances of force, albeit even if they are not lethal, would still also not mirror the message of Christ in the sense of turning the other cheek. So there is an arbitrariness or for why he would be okay with, let's say, tackling an intruder or hitting him with a baseball bat and not using lethal force. Because regardless of whether the force is lethal or not, private persons do not have the license or the liberty to use force, physical force, on other people. So.
Right, and to be clear, we're not saying that the self-defense actually does contradict turn the other cheek, but that seems to be the grounds on which Bierman is arguing, right?
Right. The logic of Bierman's argument would seem to entail pacifism in the sense that he says that if it does not reflect the teachings of Christ on the Sermon on the Mount, let's say, then it is not permissible for a Christian. But if we were to apply that standard consistently, then it would simply entail that a Christian could use no force at all, even if not lethal. So the relevant question here is, why is Dr. Bierman okay with physical force, let's say a subduing force, but not lethal force, when both of them are not instances of turning the other cheek, for example?
Right. And I think maybe one way to like steelman him is to say, well, you know, in the case of, say, using non-lethal force, let's say you knock the guy out and then he gets the fair and speedy trial. And then let's say even the guy had, say, already killed someone, and then he's in a state where they have death penalty. At least he would have the chance, for example, to have private confession if he somehow repented. And then, you know, he would go on to receive the death penalty. So maybe there's like some sort of steelman here of like, well, you shouldn't be the one as just a random citizen to take a life, because there should be fair and speedy trial before the death penalty, for example, so that you can have fair and speedy trial and you can have the opportunity to, I guess, repent and confess before the death penalty is carried out. Maybe, but he does not say this at all. I am strictly steelmaning him with things outside of it to try and make his argument make sense.
That logic would make the death penalty problematic, because nobody would ever convert. If the thing is, we're not going to kill you till you convert, right? Then it's like, well,
I simply mean giving the opportunity, you know, that the person who is on death row should have the opportunity to give private confession before the penalty is carried out, to be clear. I'm not saying that people will actually do this, but one could think of hypothetically that maybe people should have the opportunity to have private confession before, you know, the death penalty is applied. Maybe that's an idea. Bierman is not saying this at all. I'm just, you know, trying to provide some sort of reasonable explanation for why he would say this.
Yeah, well, you have to also look at how God deals with this. And if you think that the authority to kill actually comes from God, do you think that everyone on earth at the time of the flood had heard Noah's preaching and had an opportunity to repent? I kind of doubt it. Sometimes God just says your time is up, and I think it's reasonable that the government can do that too. I also wanted to poke a hole in
and that's just one of the temporal consequences of sin. If you live a certain lifestyle, then you place yourself in a situation where you may die before you have the opportunity to, you know, correct your life and, you know, make reconciliation with the Lord.
Yeah. Later, I think he says, well, Christians shouldn't do it, but they could hire private security to be at the church to do it. At which point, you'd better not evangelize the cops. Otherwise, you're going to run out of cops, right? Because whenever the cops join the church, they're so now you have this weird dilemma where you're caring about the criminals, or the general populace not thinking poorly of the church, but heaven forbid the cops convert, because then they can't be cops anymore. Unless you're going to say, well, no, because then they still have the office of cop, at which point then the Christian nation can just say, all right, ushers can wear a uniform, like a badge or something, and then you've solved your problem. So I don't think that logic holds up.
Right. And also, I think there's an amount of prudence here to say, you know, let's say the example of the baseball bat, which he uses. If your security detail carries baseball bats rather than guns, let's say the security detail are ushers in the church or some other member, you are putting others at risk here in terms of greater goods, because you could talk about Christian witness. You can also talk about the defense of other people, the defense of your neighbor. And the odds that you're stopping someone with, you know, strong firearms, you know, modern firearms, and say even body protection, body armor with baseball bats, you know, you are running against the odds here, right? So if you want to defend your congregants, or even just, you know, your neighbors in general, whoever they may be, you are better off with the firearm to defend them, rather than, you know, risking perhaps several deaths by trying to use the baseball bat. And, you know, it's very possible that someone gets off, you know, a number of bullets before you subdue them with a baseball bat, whereas, you know, a firearm has range and immediate effectiveness.
And if you're going to be utilitarian about it, one of the things that Waltherian Lutherans confess is that every congregation has hypocrites in it, right? Those are people who don't have saving faith. How many of those is the shooter going to kill? So if our goal is to maximize souls in heaven, we can kill one guy and maybe he repents before he bleeds out. Maybe he came in right during the sermon and right at that second, who knows? But we've saved all the people whose salvation may well be in jeopardy already in the congregation from going to hell too. So, I mean, but you don't want to be utilitarian about it because that's disgusting. But if that's how you're going to think.
Yeah, no, that's fair. And Bierman does believe that there are hypocrites in the congregation, to be clear. And in fact, at one point he says that
quite a few.
He says, at one point he seems to suggest that a lot of members in congregations are hypocritical.
And remember, the bigger the church is, the more hypocrites there are, right? Ex hypothesis, because, right? So remember, because the more Christianity spreads, the less authentic it becomes, because then people just go to church, go through the motions. So the bigger the church, the more hypocrites, the more souls in jeopardy from the shooter. Sorry, that's so disgusting and pedantic, but it's an argument.
Yeah, there's a thought experiment there. So Bierman argues, like I mentioned earlier, about Kierkegaard talking about Denmark and about how the state is enforcing going to church, and therefore you have a lot of people in church, but then only, to use his own language, which he's referring to a Luther quote, but I think Luther's exaggerating, saying only 1 in 1,000 in the pews are saved. Pews is my addendum. Pews didn't exist at the time of Luther, but 1 in 1,000 in the congregation are actually Christian. I think Luther is speaking hyperbolically here. Luther might be right that the vast majority weren't, say, maybe 1 in 10 or something like that, or 1 in 20. But Bierman seems to be under the impression that you have this at a large scale, and suddenly you have very few Christians in the congregation. So this leads to some odd conclusions about how you would want to apply things. Does this mean you should have as many persecutors of the church as possible, therefore to grow the church? Should the state be anti-Christian because the church lives on the blood of martyrs?
Right.
Odd conclusions, odd thought experiments that you could come up with.
I gotta go. Thanks, guys.
Yeah, thanks, Noah.
Have a good one. Yeah.
Samuel, I didn't know if you wanted to say too much more. That is all the main topics that get discussed. I do want to touch on Constantine a little bit because that gets mentioned.
Sure, we can look at those clips and close out with that.
Yeah, I don't recall where the Constantine clips are. I can search the transcript.
Just search the transcript.
Let me pull that up. Show transcript, and then I can search for. Everyone can see my shorts feed about cooking things. I do like to cook. Turkish delight and whatnot. Turkish delight's good, by the way. I've made it before. Let's see. Constantine. They talk about Constantine. He mentions at one point that Constantine's a hero. I'm wondering if it's not clipping like the person. I'm wondering the transcript. Oh, here it is. Yeah. Okay, it's actually a little backwards. I have to go backwards to find it. That's okay. Right. We'll skip around a little bit. This will be the last section we'll cover because it is getting a little late. We've been going for a while.
This is where they talk about the kind of the pros and cons of Constantinianism versus a secular culture and the pitfalls of both.
Yeah, it is. So let's cover that section briefly. I do have a lot of quotes on Constantine from our documentation. This is where they discuss it. They discuss in this spot we're skipping to. They were discussing previously the pitfalls and benefits of having a very outwardly Christian magistrate, such as in Lutheran Saxony or in Denmark at the time of Kierkegaard, where the magistrate is enforcing external observance of the law. And Bierman is concerned of the hypocrites in the church because of this. He thinks it's hard to identify the hypocrites in the church, and he sees this as a pitfall. He does recognize some of the benefits about external observance of the law. And Ramirez is taking the position that he'd rather have that type of situation where there is external observance of the law and you have hypocrites in the churches. And Bierman's saying, no, he'd rather have a situation actually where that is not the case. There's not as much external observance of the law, but you can identify hypocrites in the church. So the trade-off is hypocrites in the church versus external observance of the law. Bierman seems to think that it's better to be able to identify hypocrites and not have as much external observance. Ramirez,
which is still even somewhat of a false dichotomy, because even when the church is being persecuted, you're always going to have hypocrites within the church. So there is no divine promise from God that when the church is persecuted, there's going to be no false actors within the church. Of course, there's going to be a lesser amount, just given the circumstances, but nevertheless, I think that is worth mentioning.
Yeah, let's start. I'm just looking at the transcript here. Well, let's start about here where Bierman says his concerns with Christendom or Constantinianism. And what they seem to mean by Constantinianism is this sort of more top-down enforcement of the external observance of the law, to be clear. That's what they have in mind.
Playing the game. And see, my concern with Christendom or Constantinianism is it, in a sense, undercuts the actual confession of Christ. And I would say the gospel gets lost. And now we're back to what is the task of the church? What is our number one task? Proclaim Christ, help people to follow Christ. And you know this even now, even in our own LCMS, how many Christian families who come to church even weekly are actually serious about living the Christian life zealously, and their families and actually doing this. It's usually can count them on one hand, your families that are just that committed and willing to make the hard choices. Like, no, we're not going to do sports because that's going to interfere with my Christian child's spiritual formation. Not many families willing to make those kinds of commitments. And so I think it becomes even harder to have the clarity of what it means to live the Christian life in a Christendom kind of world.
Yeah. And I do think that I guess to me that there are dangers on both sides. And I think the early church is a good example. There was the huge critique, especially among the monastics or proto-monastics, when all these people flow into the church and now nobody takes it seriously. Right. That's the classic example. I appreciate it. But I would point out that during the persecutions, yes, there were many faithful martyrs. Yeah. There are many people who died for the faith. There were tons. And yeah, you know where I'm going. Yeah. I would much rather, I would take a very positive view of Constantinianism, because to me, it's like, it is a picking of a poison. If you have the church assaulted by the world, you have some advantages, you have some clarity, but you have other pitfalls, and people do apostatize. If you do have Constantinianism, it could become an idol. The church and the state could become overly comfy, and you lose the church critiquing the state. That's the huge problem. But I view those as very equal pitfalls. Okay. And so I would rather have the good with Constantinianism, knowing that you're going to have poison with both. All right. You might as well take something. Yeah. I'll take the no Constantinianism. But no, seriously, because I think the church being the church is the better thing to go with. Even though you have said, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but that the ideal would be Luther Saxony. An ideal would be every single person following Christ. Yeah. Is Luther Saxony doing that? I think Luther himself would say, no, fair enough. Point taken. Let me rephrase it. Even though you have said that the ideal is that every person following Christ, and that the rulers and citizenry, according to their Christian vocations, are actually... That would be awesome. Okay. That'd be awesome. But that's Constantinianism. Well, yeah. And there's a story apocryphal about how Stanley Hauerwas, who hates Constantinianism. Yeah. But he was in some little place. I think I mentioned this to you guys earlier, but he was in some little town in Ireland, and he happened to be there when there was a confirmation Sunday, and the whole town shuts down, and everybody comes to church, and everybody's there, and everybody's together on the same page of the stuff. And he made the comment, "If this is Constantinianism, I'm all for it." Yeah. And because that's the idea. It can look good. It can be a beautiful thing, but it's so rare and so unusual. And probably it happens best. You talked about the territorialism, or, the kind of, I'm drawing a blank on my terminology here. Anyway, the idea that the local thing is where it needs to happen. Yeah. I'm totally with that. Yeah, that's the ideal, and that would be a good thing. And do I want everybody to know Christ? And wouldn't it be awesome if all the families in my neighborhood that my kids were playing with all had the same agenda I did, and all went to the same church, and went to the same church, and all valued the same things, and all were trying to raise their kids to follow Christ? That'd be awesome. Yeah, I won't complain. Because I think that is an inherent desire of a rightly formed Christian. Sure, and sure, but. That's Constantinianism. Yeah, no. It might be Christendom. Okay, fine, whatever. Yeah. Constantinianism to you has certain illusions of. Yeah. I'm not convinced Constantine was that sincere. Oh, that's all another I know. I think he was. I think his mom and sister probably were, but I'm not so sure about Constantine himself. So. Okay. He was pretty. He's a hero of mine, so I'm just. Oh yeah, he is. He's not mine. Yeah, but yeah.
He was a good warrior, no doubt about that. And he knew how to read the signs of the times. He was a great, sharp politician.
Yeah.
No doubt about that.
All right, couple questions.
All right, that is the end of that section.
Right.
I think.
Yeah.
I
think it is worthwhile
sure.
to discuss just the supposed pros and cons of Constantinianism versus a society in which the church is persecuted, because as Dr. Bierman states, the benefit of having a non-Christian state, or at least a state that doesn't have a forced Christian observance to the kind of external commandments of the law, is that you will be able to discern who are the hypocritical Christians and who are the sincere Christians. But it doesn't seem to me that Dr. Bierman really engages with whether or not that is a sufficient pro over and against living in a society where you do not have, for instance, let's say, open public blasphemy, and whether or not that affects, other commandments in terms of the second table of the law.
It's unclear to me what Bierman means by saying that he wants Christendom but not Constantinianism.
Right.
I'm not sure what the supposed.
He seemed to have personal reservations about whether or not Constantine himself was a believer, but that's largely irrelevant to the larger question.
Yeah, exactly. So I'm not exactly sure what, and I've listened to this like 3.5 times, three, and now I guess like about 4 times that I've listened to this interview, and I'm not still 100% sure what Bierman wants. He does seem to want external observance enforced by the magistrate of the second table of the law, and he says he wants that for the first table of the law too, but it's very unclear what he means by that, because he also opposes things like, for example, mandating church attendance or removing or even having just like an immigration ban on Muslims, which would be First Amendment issue. Or for example, they discussed the Hindu statue put up in Texas recently that did get mentioned in the conversation, and Bierman didn't mention tearing it down, which is right about you should not have idols, right? So it's not clear to me what he means by external observance of the first table of the law, but he does say in words in the discussion that he wants the magistrate, that is, to.
Yeah, as far as I can tell, it does seem to be a slip of the tongue, or perhaps just an inconsistency in his position, because if you do follow the logical conclusions of his paradigm, or at least of the major premises that he set down so far, it does seem to entail that his ideal political magistrate would only enforce the second table of the law. He may have given nominal assent to enforcement at the first table of the law, but I don't see how that exactly fits with everything else he said thus far.
Yeah, I think he might maybe think that first table of the law enforcement by the magistrate is something more along the lines of protecting the ability of citizens to practice the first table of the law, and maybe even making it easy, or something like tax breaks for churches. Unclear though what exactly it means.
But it doesn't seem to entail protecting the consciences of Christians who are, going to church, so on and so forth, and removing stumbling blocks to their consciences, which is relevant to Section 54 of the Treatise on the Power and Primacy of the Pope, where it says that one of the primary concerns is protecting consciences.
Right, and it is relevant, I think, on this point. I don't know what his gripe is specifically with Constantine or Constantinianism, but if his issue is, using the church or using the state to fund the building of churches, I'm not sure what Christian society hasn't done that. He would have to be going against virtually every Christian society to make a statement like that. So it wouldn't even be Constantinianism. That would be Christendom, which he says he supports. That's what all Christendom has always done, is using state funds to, say, build churches or help pay clergy. The state churches have always also called for councils and things like that. And Kalov specifically says that this is one of the duties of the church, one of the duties of the magistrate, the Christian magistrate, is to call for councils when there are issues in the church, to maintain the peace of the church that way, and to refute heresies. So if his issue is with, for example, the Council of Nicaea, that the Constantine shouldn't have called that should have been handled by the church officials instead. It's just, that's something that's not unique to Constantine. So it's unclear to me why he would have reservations about that.
Or why he would have reservations about something like that.
Yeah, I don't know why. And even if you just read the Old Testament,
Right. Because what does that have to do
is
with
it not
the church?
Yeah, is it the case that the rulers in the Old Testament called for councils of religious leaders? That is to say, does the magistrates, do the kings and judges in the Old Testament call
Yeah.
for the gathering of ecclesiastical officials? And the answer is they do. So we have
Yeah.
examples from this in Scripture.
Ironically, too, it is interesting because it seems that one of the fundamental contentions of Dr. Bierman is that the political magistracy needs to be sensitive to the witness of the church, but that almost implies that the church and the political magistracy are the same. If whereas it doesn't seem clear to me that the scriptures ever outline or suggest that there needs to be such a sensitivity in the political magistrate, if that makes sense. But to say that the political magistrate or magistracy cannot do X, Y, or Z because it would inhibit or it would weaken the witness of the church, it would almost seem to imply that the functions and the actions of the political magistracy are the same as the functions and actions of the church. So do you get what I'm saying there?
Yeah. I do want to read some of these Constantine quotes. So Constantine is mentioned a lot of times in our dogmaticians on the issue of magistrates. And in fact, he's even used as an authority when they're appealing to things. When they say, they're trying to make an argument for some position and they want to prove that this is what a good Christian ruler would do, they will appeal to Constantine as an example of what a good Christian ruler would do. So they even use him as a defense for arguments. But I'd like to read some of the quotes on Constantine himself. What do our dogmaticians think? First, here are two from Hollatz. Hollatz says in the sixth question of his political magistrate section in his dogmatics, he says, "He who gave the empire to the Christian Constantine also gave it to the apostate Julian." And this is actually a quote from Augustine in his City of God, Book 5, Section 21. So he calls Constantine a Christian, which Bierman doubts. And then in question 7, Hollatz says, "Many rulers like Constantine the Great, both Theodosiuses, Marcion, and Charlemagne, are examples of rulers who combined their faith with the office of magistrate." And he's not saying that like a bad thing as in combining their faith with the office of magistrate. He's saying this is a good thing. Kirchner wrote an appendix to the Book of Concord, to be clear, so he is pretty highly regarded. This is Timothy Kirchner. He helped write the apology for the Book of Concord. He says, "There are those who understand what their office is and direct it toward the end for which God himself established it. Such were David, Solomon, Hezekiah, Constantine the Great, and many other God-fearing rulers more." So Constantine's being grouped with David, Solomon, and Hezekiah. Another one, here's Kalov. Kalov says, "The Christian magistrate is not to be excluded from the care of sacred things and religion, that it does not above all things fall to him. Against the papists who exclude the magistrate as a layman from this care." So the Roman Catholics are saying that laymen should not be the magistrate, rather we should have, Catholic integralism. So he says, "Hence we argue, whatever care the divine law itself prescribes for the magistrate with certain rulers and aphorisms, from that he is not to be excluded. We prove the minor premise from examples also of Christian emperors, Constantine the Great, Marcion, Theodosius, etc." That's from Kalov's. This is his fourth question in his single volume dogmatics on the topic.
Right.
Two more. Selnecker says, so Selnecker is one of the authors of the Formula of Concord. He says in the third section of his doctrine on the political magistrate in his dogmatics, the Institutes of Christian Religion, which he takes the same name as Calvin, kind of funnily enough. He says, "Rather with all diligence they should refute errors and set before themselves the examples of pious kings and princes, such as Asa, 1 Kings 15, 2 Chronicles 14, Hezekiah, 1 Kings 18, Josiah, 1 Kings 23, as well as Constantine, Valentinian, Gratian, Theodosius, and others." And in his section on war, he says, "A legitimate war is such a defense undertaken by a magistrate divinely ordained, as when Constantine defended the pious against the cruelty of Licinius." So this is all over. I mean, there was Kalov, there was Selnecker, there was Kirchner, there was Hollatz. I mean, this is all sorts of people. All of our major dogmaticians are on the same page here. Constantine is considered, always call him Constantine the Great. They say he's a Christian. They say to emulate him. They put him in the same group as David. I mean, they clearly have an enormous amount of respect for Constantine and think he was a hero.
And regardless of whether it is the case that Constantine himself was a regenerate Christian, it still isn't clear what about Constantine's policy or his political maneuvers would Dr. Bierman consider unbefitting of a Christian magistrate.
Right. I'm not sure what he has in mind here.
Right, because even if we can see that Constantine himself was a hypocrite, right? Let's just say that he was not a Christian. It still may be the case that his political decisions that he made as a supposed Christian emperor could still be good. And even if he was not a Christian, it would still beg the question, why did all of our Lutheran dogmaticians quote him in such a positive light?
Right. And Constantine's not even banning the other religions. That's not what he does.
Right.
He doesn't ban paganism from the empire. So it's if Bierman's just worried about, well, if you ban paganism from the empire, then you'll have people being Christians who are hypocrites. Constantine didn't do that. So yeah, it's not clear to me what he has wrong with Constantine and what this Constantinianism is that is different from Christendom more broadly. That he seems to support Christendom but doesn't support Constantinianism. I'm not exactly sure what that means. Especially because he seems to have trouble with Lutheran Saxony and with 18th century Denmark. So like if he has problems with those and he has problems with Constantine, which Christendom does he like? Which variety in history does he think did it best? And even if it's not the ideal, I know he's big on not over realizing eschatology. As Ramirez says, and then Bierman agrees with. But there should be still, places where you can say, well, here it was done better, here it was done first.
Right, relatively well, at least.
Yeah, where's the spectrum? Which time and place kind of had the best that we ever had? Even if that's not great, according to Bierman, what was the best that we've ever had? Can we strive to at least get to that point?
Yeah, it even is somewhat related to our notion of the Church Catholic, because of course, as Lutherans, we would say that we are inheriting the theological tradition of the Church Catholic, and presumably that part of that theological deposit that we are inheriting from the Church Catholic would be an understanding of the political magistracy. So even if it has never been instituted or instantiated in a perfect degree, nevertheless, insofar as we endeavor to be Catholic, presumably there would be at least a relative understanding of what a Christian magistrate would look like. But according to Dr. Bierman, apparently there has never been an instance of that in a relatively successful degree.
Yeah. I didn't have anything more to discuss, really. I did realize that I forgot to have one of the quotes on self-defense. Self-defense is not really covered that much by our dogmaticians. And I know I'm circling back around to a topic we already covered. I didn't see it really covered much in the dogmaticians, mainly because that's not really what they're addressing in their doctrine of the civil magistrate. Like self-defense is kind of in the issue of Fifth Commandment, which I have translated some of their stuff on Fifth Commandment when it seems relevant. But I do have one quote from Hollatz that I do think is relevant. And here it is. It's from his 9th question, the issue of the political magistrate. He says, "For he who has been provoked by injury from another, and thus thinks about avenging and repelling the injury, and preventing greater evils, does not offend the other, but defends himself." Now, is this explicitly in favor of using lethal force? No, I guess not. But I do think the note about avenging oneself, like you could take repelling the injury to be about, using non-lethal force. I do think avenging oneself, if the intent was to use lethal force against you, I do think you could take avenging yourself to be the permission to use lethal force against the opponent, because usually vengeance is taken to be equal, and if they're using lethal force against you, vengeance, would entail that you can use lethal force against the other. So I think that's valid. In terms of,
and again, the only reason why a Christian wouldn't, and again, the only reason why a Christian wouldn't be able to use lethal force, according to Dr. Bierman, would be because it is not reflecting the message of Christ. But if that is the only relevant criterion, then that also applies to non-lethal force. So if non-lethal force is okay, then it follows logistically that lethal force would be permissible, at least.
Right. Also, I'm not sure that Halatz's language about avenging would sit well with Dr. Bierman. I can't say for sure. We don't have him in the
which
room.
is why I said earlier the Dr. Bierman's position would seem to entail just total pacifism.
Yeah, and he also says, he does say at one point too, that he doesn't think we have a duty to self-defense. He says only about protecting our neighbor. But when what Halatz says here, if you allow me to read the quote again, for he who has been provoked by injury from another. So he's saying if you yourself are being provoked by injury to another, in other words, someone else attacking you, someone's attacking you, and this person that's being attacked, you think about avenging and repelling the injury. He says that's defense of oneself and does not offend the other. He does mention and preventing greater evils, which presumably is attacking other people, but that's an and. He says you can avenge yourself, you can repel the injury, you can also prevent greater evils, that is to say defend others. But he says you don't, like, he's not making an or statement. He's not saying you have to have all of these. He's saying that any of these are relevant. So if you are being attacked and you want to avenge and repel the injury, and it's just you there's no one else in danger, he's saying you can defend yourself without being worried about offense to the other person, that is to say, sinning against him. So Halatz is clearly in favor of self-defense, even when there's not defense of neighbor, for example. And I think he also is saying if they're using lethal force, you can respond with lethal force, because vengeance is proportionate.
Right.
I know circling back to a discussion we already had, but I do think it's relevant. And I forgot to recite the quote, and I think it is a good quote from Halatz to give a spot from our dogmaticians on the subject.
Yeah.
Well, I don't have anything else. Do you have anything else to close out?
No, not particularly to add to everything else that we've said thus far.
All right. I didn't see any questions in chat that we didn't really address. We didn't necessarily exactly address every single question, but we did in general address the topics that were being discussed. As a child, did you look for the cow that gives chocolate milk? I thought it was funny, but no, I didn't. That was the only real question we had in chat left. So thank you everyone for coming on and watching. Hope you. Oh, I just saw Cameron came on. Cam, I don't know when you joined. I didn't see it.
Pretty much just now. So.
Oh, okay, cool.
There you go.
Well, we're literally wrapping up.
Yeah, you're tweeting us for the outro.
Oh, you're muted too.
Very epic. Very epic. I made my first appearance in a while. So.
There you go. You have any introductory and final remarks simultaneously?
I disagree with everything that you guys said.
There you go.
Very good. All right. Well, thank you everyone for watching. The link to the full debate is in the description. Go ahead and watch it. On the Line has good material, so give them some views. There's also, you can listen to the whole discussion that way because we didn't have time to cover every single point. Remember to I'll switch the description. I don't think I have our info in there for following us on X and following us on Patreon and becoming patrons, but I'll stick that in there. Like and subscribe and all that stuff. Thank you for watching, and everyone
and
have
keep an eye out for the political content.
Oh yeah, keep an eye out for that. I'll make an announcement both on the channel and on X, and I'll definitely make a video when we actually have physical copies of it. Also, at some point, I would like to do a second volume that is Gerhard, Quenstead, Kalov, maybe Brockman, some of these longer dogmatics texts, which I'm not including in the compend simply because they're so enormous in terms of their volume of content that including them in the compend would really break up the flow too much. Right. It'd be nice to just have that as a single compilation volume where we have each of them addressing the subject just on their own. And you can read all of Gerhard, then all of Quenstead, then all of Kalov, all of Brockman, things like this.
Yeah, you should add Brinkman to that list.
Brinkman. But yeah, I would like to include all of those. I do have Kalov and Gerhard included, but just their single volume dogmatics.
Right.
Gerhard has his aphorisms.
Doesn't
Kalov
Gerhard even have like an entire locus just on marriage, right?
Yeah, Gerhard has an entire locus on marriage, which I don't think I'd be including because it's kind of secondary to the topic of
Sure.
the magistrate. But maybe a whole nother volume on the 3 estates.
But it just goes to show
We also
how
don't want to piss off our Elka viewers. They might be very upset if we published this volume on marriage.
Yeah, they might be. But yeah, maybe we'll do that too. But yeah, keep an eye out for the content. It's going to be really good. We put in quite a few quotes of that into this video. If you want more on the political magistrate from a Lutheran perspective, we have 2 videos. We have 2 reacting to Christic liberalism videos on Javier Perdomo's channel, which I believe were good reaction videos. Check out those. And we also have a video from Gerhard. It's a narration of his section in his aphorisms on the magistrate. Go check out that. And that's all we have. Thank you, everyone, for watching, and have a good night.